I didn't raise my voice. I didn't snap back. I didn't make a scene. I just stood there, holding a paper plate with lukewarm food on it, watching my brother lean down to my kids and say, in that calm, condescending tone he uses when he wants to feel important, "Don't touch that. It's not for you." And something in me quietly clicked into place. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Just clarity. I'm Brian. I'm 38. I've been the easygoing one in my family for as long as I can remember. The one who lets comments slide. The one who smooths things over. The one who shows up, contributes, and somehow still ends up being treated like an accessory instead of a person. That holiday gathering was just supposed to be another one of those days. A few hours, polite smiles, kids running around, adults pretending everything was fine. I had no idea it would end up exposing a truth my family had been dancing around for years. We were at my parents' place, a big rented house they'd booked for the holidays. My brother Mark had arranged most of it, or at least that's what he kept saying. I handled the reservations. I put everything on my card. "Don't worry about it. I've got it covered." He said those things loudly, often, usually within earshot of anyone who might be impressed by them. Mark has always loved the performance of generosity more than the act itself. I arrived with my two kids a little later than everyone else. Traffic, restless backseat negotiations, the usual. When we walked in, the house was already buzzing. Music playing, coats piled on chairs, glasses clinking. My parents greeted us warmly, hugged the kids, told me how glad they were we made it. Normal enough. Comfortable, even. For a moment, I thought maybe this year would be different. It didn't take long for the small signals to start appearing. Mark barely acknowledged me. Not rude, exactly, just distant. Like I was a co-worker he tolerated rather than a brother. My sister-in-law gave me a quick smile and then turned back to her phone. The kids gravitated toward the living room where there was a table set up with snacks, desserts, and a few things that looked nicer than usual. Specialty chocolates, imported cookies, some elaborate pastry tray. My kids' eyes lit up, because of course they did. That's when it happened. My youngest reached for one of the pastries. He didn't grab it, didn't stuff it into his mouth. Just reached, the way kids do when something looks special. Mark was suddenly there, appearing out of nowhere, gently but firmly placing his hand over the tray and saying, "Hey, buddy, don't touch that. It's not for you." The room didn't go silent. No dramatic pause. Conversations continued. Music played, but I felt it anyway. The shift. The way a few heads turned just enough to notice. The way my kid froze, confused, hand hovering in the air, looking back at me like he'd done something wrong. "For who?" my son asked, genuinely puzzled. Mark smiled. Not a cruel smile. Worse, a patient one. "Those are for later. For the adults." I could have corrected him right there. Could have said, calmly, that we were all family, that it was just food, that my kids didn't need to feel singled out. I could have made it awkward. I could have made it obvious. Instead, I put my hand on my son's shoulder and said, "Hey, it's okay. Let's grab something else." And that was that. Or at least, that's what everyone else thought. Inside, something old stirred. A memory, maybe. A familiar feeling I hadn't let myself name in a long time. This wasn't about pastries. It never is. It was about who was seen as belonging and who was treated like a guest who should be grateful just to be there. This wasn't new. It just hadn't been this obvious in front of my kids before. Growing up, Mark was the golden one. The confident one. The one my parents bragged about. I was the steady one. Reliable. The one who didn't cause trouble. That dynamic followed us into adulthood in ways I didn't fully appreciate until much later. Mark got praise for big gestures. I got silence for quiet consistency. Mark liked to take charge. I liked to avoid conflict. It worked, in a lopsided way, as long as I didn't look too closely. Over the years, I'd chipped in for family trips, group gifts, emergencies. Sometimes directly, sometimes quietly covering gaps when someone else forgot. I never announced it. Never needed credit. I just wanted things to run smoothly. I wanted my kids to grow up around family, not tension. After the pastry incident, I kept my distance. Played with the kids. Helped in the kitchen. Listened more than I talked. And the more I listened, the more little comments stacked up. Mark talking about costs. About how expensive everything was. About how stressful it had been to front all this money. He wasn't asking for anything outright, but the implication hung in the air like a price tag. At one point, my mom pulled me aside and thanked me for coming anyway. The wording struck me. Coming anyway. as if there had been a question about whether we belonged. I smiled, said of course, we wouldn't miss it. Later that night, after the kids were asleep on a borrowed couch, I stood alone in the hallway and stared at my phone. There was a notification there, one I'd seen earlier and ignored. A quiet confirmation email. Nothing dramatic. Just a reminder of something I'd handled weeks ago, without fanfare, without telling anyone. I slipped the phone back into my pocket as Mark laughed loudly from the other room, telling a story about how he put everything on his card and hoped the bank wouldn't complain. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't correct the story, because I knew something he didn't. And the next day, when my phone rang and his name lit up the screen, I already knew the tone he was going to use before he even spoke. When Mark called the next morning, I was sitting at the small kitchen table by the window, nursing a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The kids were still asleep, tangled in blankets on the pull-out couch, their quiet breathing the only steady thing in the house. I watched my phone buzz with his name on the screen and felt that strange calm again. The kind that comes when something you've been carrying for a long time finally starts to show its shape. Hey, I answered, keeping my voice neutral. Brian, Mark said, not bothering with a greeting. There was an edge in his tone, sharp but controlled, like he was already annoyed and trying to pretend he wasn't. We need to talk. Okay. There was a pause, like he expected me to ask what about. When I didn't, he cleared his throat. My card isn't working. Anywhere. Gas station, grocery store, even the hotel desk downstairs. Declined. I called the bank, and they said there's an issue. I let the silence stretch just a little. That's rough. Yeah, well, he snapped, then caught himself. I'm sure it's just a temporary hold or something. But it's kind of a problem, considering I put everything on it for this trip. I pictured him pacing, phone pressed to his ear, already irritated by the inconvenience, already framing it as something happening to him rather than something he might need to deal with. What do you need from me? I asked. Another pause. I might need you to cover a few things today, just until this gets sorted. I mean, you know how much I've already spent. Flights, the house, food. It adds up. There it was. The ask, wrapped in entitlement, dressed up as a favor. Like it was obvious I would say yes. Like I always did. I'll see what I can do, I said. That seemed to satisfy him, at least for the moment. He launched into a long explanation of how inconvenient this was, how embarrassing it had been at the front desk, how the staff had looked at him like he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't ask how my kids were, didn't ask if we needed anything, just talked, filling the space, reinforcing the version of events where he was the generous organizer temporarily inconvenienced by a technical glitch. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring out at the pale winter light. I wasn't angry. I was tired. Tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. The rest of that day was a slow grind of small moments that all pointed in the same direction. Mark insisted on handling plans, but only when there was an audience. He suggested outings that conveniently required someone else to pay up front. He made jokes about how some people didn't realize how expensive things were, glancing at me like I was a supporting character in his story. At lunch, he ordered freely, adding appetizers and drinks without asking anyone else. When the check came, he reached for his wallet, paused theatrically, then sighed. Right. The card thing. Brian, can you get this? I did. Quietly. Without comment. My kids noticed, though. They always do. My oldest leaned over and whispered, Dad, why does Uncle Mark always say it's his card but you pay? I smiled at him and said we'd talk later. But the question stayed with me. That afternoon, my parents pulled me aside. We stood near the back porch, the cold air seeping in through a cracked door. My mom clasped her hands together, nervous, and my dad avoided my eyes. Mark's really stressed, my mom said. He's taken on so much responsibility for this trip. I nodded. I know. Maybe you could help out a bit more, my dad added. Just to ease the burden. There it was again. The assumption. The quiet expectation that I would step in, smooth things over, absorb the discomfort so no one else had to feel it. I already am, I said evenly. They didn't ask what I meant. They didn't really want to know. That night, the tension thickened. Mark's patience wore thinner with each declined transaction. He snapped at servers, muttered under his breath, complained loudly about banks and fraud alerts. At one point, he joked that someone must have messed something up behind the scenes. His eyes flicked toward me when he said it, just for a second. Later, after the kids were asleep again, he cornered me in the hallway. You wouldn't happen to know anything about why my card's frozen, would you? I met his gaze. No. He studied my face, searching for something. A crack. A tell. When he didn't find it, he scoffed. Figures. You've always been lucky with money. Things just seem to work out for you. It wasn't a compliment. It was an accusation. The next morning was when everything shifted from uncomfortable to unbearable. We were supposed to check out of the house by noon. Mark had promised to handle it. Instead, he spent the morning pacing, arguing with his bank on speakerphone, his frustration echoing through the living room. My kids sat quietly on the couch, sensing the mood, trying to stay out of the way. At one point, my youngest asked if he could have one of the leftover pastries from the tray that had been set aside for later. Mark heard him and snapped. I said those weren't for you. Something in my chest tightened. Not anger. Resolve. I stood up. They're just food, Mark. He turned on me, eyes flashing. It's not about the food. It's about respect. I paid for this trip. I paid for everything here. The room went still. My parents looked between us. My kids stared at the floor. That's not exactly true, I said calmly. Mark laughed, short and sharp. Oh, you want to start keeping score now? I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not confidence but fear. Fear of losing control of the narrative he'd built. Before I could say anything else, my phone buzzed. A text message. From the airline. A simple notification about ticket changes. I glanced at it, then slipped the phone back into my pocket. Mark noticed. His eyes narrowed. What was that? Nothing, I said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You've been acting strange. Since we got here. Like you're hiding something. I thought about all the years I'd hidden my contributions. All the times I'd let him take credit. All the moments I'd swallowed my discomfort to keep the peace. Maybe I'm just done pretending, I said. That was when he did it. When he crossed the line that couldn't be uncrossed. He turned to my parents and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. You know, maybe if Brian hadn't been so irresponsible with his finances over the years, he wouldn't be so sensitive about who pays for what. I mean, we all remember how he needed help after that mess he got himself into. The room spun. I felt heat rush to my face, not because of the accusation itself, but because of where he was aiming it. At my kids. At their ears. At their understanding of who their father was. That's not fair, my mom said weakly, but she didn't stop him. Mark kept going. I'm just saying, there's a reason I handle the money stuff. Some people aren't built for it. My oldest looked up at me then. Confusion and hurt etched across his face. Dad, I took a breath. Slow. Measured. We're leaving, I said. What? Mark scoffed. Don't be dramatic. I'm not, I said, already gathering our things. We're leaving. As we packed, my phone buzzed again. Another message. This one from my bank. Confirmation. Finalized. Locked in. Mark watched me, suspicion turning into something else. Brian, he said, his voice suddenly quieter. You didn't. I met his eyes. You really think you paid for everything? The color drained from his face as the implication sank in. My parents stared at me, startled, like they were seeing a version of me they hadn't accounted for. What are you talking about? My dad asked. Before I could answer, Mark's phone rang. He looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. His hand shook as he answered. Hello, he said. I watched his expression change as the voice on the other end spoke. Confusion, then disbelief, then something very close to panic. And that's where I stopped talking, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to rush in and explain anything. Mark didn't say another word while he was on the phone. He just stood there, shoulders stiff, eyes locked on some invisible point on the wall as the person on the other end explained something he very clearly had not been prepared to hear. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I'd heard that tone before. The professional, polite one people use when they're delivering inconvenient truths and don't want to be blamed for them. When he finally hung up, the house felt different. Quieter, but not peaceful. Heavy, like the air before a storm finally breaks. What was that about? My mom asked, forcing a small laugh. Was it the bank again? Mark didn't answer her. He looked at me instead. Really looked. Not like a brother sizing up a sibling, but like someone trying to recalculate a situation that no longer made sense. You told them to freeze my card, he said. I shook my head. No. Then why did they say? He stopped himself, jaw tightening. They said the charges were flagged because the original payment source changed. That the reservations weren't actually under my account anymore. My dad frowned. What does that mean? It meant exactly what Mark thought it meant, and he hated it. It means, Mark said slowly, that someone else paid. The room went dead silent. I picked up my coat, helping my youngest into his jacket. We're heading out, I said again. Calm. Steady. You can all talk about it. Mark took a step toward me. You had no right. I met his gaze. I didn't take anything from you. I just stopped letting you take credit for it. That was the last thing I said before we walked out. The drive home was quiet. Not awkward quiet, thoughtful quiet. The kind where your mind finally has space to catch up with your heart. The kids watched the scenery blur past the windows, tired and overstimulated. About halfway through the drive, my oldest broke the silence. Dad, he said carefully, did Uncle Mark lie? I took a breath. Yes. About the money? Yes. Why? I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Because sometimes people like being seen a certain way more than they like being honest. He nodded, processing that, then leaned his head against the window. That was it. No more questions. Kids have a way of accepting truths adults spend years avoiding. When we got home, the crash came. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just empty. The adrenaline drained out of me. And suddenly, I felt every bit of exhaustion I'd been carrying for years. I sat on the edge of my bed long after the kids were asleep, staring at the wall, replaying moments I'd brushed aside for the sake of peace. Little humiliations. Quiet assumptions. All the times I'd told myself it wasn't worth addressing. For the first time, I wondered what it would look like if I stopped trying to be easy. The next few weeks were rough. Mark didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He went quiet, which for him was worse than yelling. My parents called a few times, their tone cautious, like they were stepping around a cracked floor. They asked if I was doing okay. They asked if I meant to embarrass Mark. They never asked why he'd spoken about me that way in front of my kids. At one point, my mom said, "You know how your brother is." He didn't mean it. I almost laughed. Instead, I said, "Intent doesn't erase impact." She didn't have a response to that. The holidays passed without another gathering. No group chats. No photos. No forced cheer. It felt strange at first, like something essential was missing. Then it felt lighter. But the fall wasn't just emotional. It was practical too. Without the constant distraction of family obligations, I started noticing how much of myself I'd been pouring into places that never really gave back. I was good at my job, had been for years, but I kept myself small there too. Took on extra work without asking for recognition. Let others speak over me in meetings. Told myself stability was enough. One night, long after the kids were asleep, I opened my laptop and pulled up an old document I hadn't touched in years. A proposal. A plan. Something I'd once been excited about before life, and responsibility, and self-doubt had pushed it aside. I started revising it. Slowly. Carefully. No big declarations. No announcements. Just quiet work. Weeks turned into months. I stopped waiting for my family to validate me. Stopped explaining myself. When Mark texted, once, late at night, something vague about how things had gotten out of hand, I didn't respond. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. I didn't know him reassurance anymore. I focused on my kids. On showing up for them in ways that didn't involve swallowing disrespect. On teaching them, by example, that boundaries weren't punishments. They were protections. The proposal turned into meetings. The meetings turned into contracts. Nothing flashy. Nothing overnight. Just steady progress built on competence instead of performance. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone in my family. I was building something because it made sense, because I was good at it, because it felt like mine. One afternoon, months later, I got a call from my dad. His voice sounded older. "Mark's having a hard time," he said. I waited. "He's in some debt. More than we realized." I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "I'm not surprised. He says you blindsided him." That one stung, but not the way it used to. "He blindsided himself," I said quietly. There was a long silence. Then my dad sighed. "You've changed." "Yes," I said. "I have." After that call, I sat in my car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, thinking about how strange it was to feel grounded in the middle of disappointment. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was solid. The rise wasn't loud. It didn't come with announcements or dramatic reveals. It came with early mornings, late nights, and a growing sense of self-respect I hadn't realized I'd been missing. It came with watching my kids see me differently. not as the guy who always gave in, but as the one who stood firm without cruelty. And then, just as things started to feel stable, the past reached out again. It was an email this time. Not from Mark. Not from my parents. It was from someone I didn't expect. Someone connected to the tickets, to the payments, to the part of the story Mark had never bothered to understand because he'd assumed it would always work out in his favor. I stared at the screen, heart thudding, as I read the subject line twice. Because whatever was coming next wasn't just about family anymore. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that this time I wasn't going to step aside quietly. I didn't open the email right away. I stared at the subject line, then locked my phone and set it face down on the desk like it might buzz on its own and make the decision for me. I'd spent months rebuilding my footing, learning how to stand without constantly bracing for someone else's reaction. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep moving forward and let the past stay where it belonged. Another part of me knew that pretending something doesn't exist doesn't make it powerless. It just makes it patient. When I finally opened it, the message was polite, almost clinical. It was from an account manager at the travel company that had handled the holiday reservations. They were conducting a routine audit and had noticed a discrepancy between the individual who had been presenting himself as the primary purchaser and the actual payment source. They wanted to confirm details. They wanted documentation. They wanted to make sure their records were accurate. I exhaled slowly. Of course they did. For years, Mark had been riding on assumptions, on the idea that no one would look too closely as long as things seemed fine on the surface. He liked the image of control, not the mechanics of it. I'd been the opposite. I liked the mechanics. I liked systems. I liked knowing exactly how things worked. That was why, months earlier, when he'd asked me to just handle the flights real quick, because he was busy, I'd done it properly. In my name. With my account. Clean, documented, traceable. I replied to the email with the requested confirmations and attached the receipts. I didn't editorialize. Didn't explain context. I let the facts speak for themselves. That was the moment I stopped reacting and started planning. I didn't want chaos. I didn't want a dramatic explosion. I wanted accountability. And if I was honest with myself, I wanted something else too. I wanted my family to finally see the version of me they'd overlooked for decades. Not the quiet helper. Not the backup plan. The one who understood the whole board. Over the next few weeks, information started coming to me without much effort. When you stop covering for someone, the gaps become visible. A mutual acquaintance mentioned Mark had been tight lately. A cousin let slip that he'd asked to borrow money for something vague and urgent. My mom called one afternoon, voice tense, asking if I knew anything about some letters Mark had received. I don't, I said honestly. What kind of letters? She hesitated. Official ones. I didn't ask more. I didn't need to. Instead, I focused on strengthening my own position. I finalized contracts, set up proper boundaries at work, put systems in place so nothing I'd built could be casually undermined. I spoke with a financial advisor, not because I was in trouble, but because I'd learned the cost of assuming things would just work out. One evening, after the kids were asleep, I laid everything out on the dining table. Not in a dramatic way, just documents, timelines, receipts, emails, a quiet map of how things had actually happened, stripped of the stories Mark liked to tell. Looking at it all together, I felt something unexpected, relief. The truth was clean, simple. It didn't need defending. The opportunity presented itself sooner than I expected. My parents decided to host a small family dinner. Nothing fancy, just to clear the air, my mom said when she called. Her voice had that careful tone again, like she was arranging fragile objects on a shelf. Mark will be there, she added. I figured, I said. You don't have to come if you're uncomfortable. I looked at the stack of documents on the table, at the quiet confidence I'd been carrying lately. I'll be there. The night of the dinner, I arrived alone. The kids were with a friend, intentionally. This wasn't something they needed to witness. When I walked into my parents' house, the atmosphere was tight. Mark sat on one end of the couch, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He looked tired, smaller somehow, not defeated, but no longer towering. We exchanged polite greetings. Nothing more. Dinner was awkward but civil. Small talk, clinking cutlery, long pauses. Everyone avoiding the obvious. Halfway through, my dad cleared his throat. So, he said, I think we should talk about what happened over the holidays. Mark scoffed. You mean when Brian decided to make me look like an idiot? I didn't react. I took a sip of water and waited. My mom turned to me. "We were surprised," she said. "We didn't know you'd paid for so much." "So was Mark," I said calmly. "That's not fair," Mark snapped. "You could have said something. Instead, you let me." He stopped himself, realizing what he was about to admit. "Let you what?" I asked. He looked away. "Let me think everything was fine." "It was fine," I said, "until you decided to use it as a weapon." That landed. My dad frowned. "Weapon?" "The comments," I said. "The way he spoke to my kids. The way he talked about me. About my finances. That wasn't stress. That was a pattern." Mark leaned forward. "You've always been jealous." I almost smiled. "Of what?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. I reached into my bag and placed a slim folder on the coffee table. Not dramatically. Just there. "I didn't come here to fight," I said. "I came to clarify a few things." My mom stared at the folder like it might bite. "What is that?" "Documentation," I said. "Of what I paid for. Of how it was presented. Of what's now being questioned by people outside this family." Mark's face drained of color. "You brought that here?" "I brought the truth," I said. "You can look at it or not. But I'm done carrying things quietly so others can look generous." Silence filled the room. Heavy, but not chaotic. This wasn't a showdown. It was an unveiling. My dad finally picked up the folder. He flipped through the pages slowly. His brow furrowed. My mom leaned over his shoulder. The longer they looked, the more their expressions changed. Confusion, then realization, then something like regret. Mark stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. You're turning family into a transaction." "No," I said softly. "You did that. I just kept the receipts." He paced, running a hand through his hair. "You think this makes you better than me?" I met his eyes. "No. It makes me done." That was when the phone rang. Mark's phone. He glanced at the screen, then at me. The same fear flickered there again. "Answer it," my dad said. Mark hesitated, then did. He didn't put it on speaker, but we could hear enough. His voice went tight. Short answers. A strained, "I understand." When he hung up, he didn't sit back down. "They're escalating," he said quietly. My mom looked at him, alarmed. "Who?" "The company," he said. "They want repayment. And they're asking questions." All eyes turned to me. "I didn't initiate that," I said. "I just stopped covering." The room buzzed with tension, with the weight of consequences finally pressing down. This wasn't revenge yet. It was alignment. Pieces falling into place exactly where they should have been all along. I stood up, picking up my bag. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I said. "But I'm also not here to protect lies anymore." My dad opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked tired, older than I remembered. As I walked toward the door, Mark said my name. Not sharp this time. Almost pleading. "Brian," he said. "We can fix this." I paused, hand on the doorknob, and turned back just enough to meet his gaze. "You had years to fix it." Then I left. Outside, the night air was cold and clear. I sat in my car for a long moment, hands steady on the wheel, heart pounding but controlled. I knew what came next wouldn't be clean or comfortable. But for the first time, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was ready. And somewhere behind me, inside that house, the version of the story Mark had been telling was finally starting to collapse. The escalation didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, methodically, the way consequences usually do when they're no longer being held back by someone else's restraint. 2 weeks after that dinner, the travel company followed up. Not with me, with Mark. They'd completed their audit. The findings were simple and damning. He had presented himself, verbally and in writing, as the purchaser and organizer of the trip while knowingly allowing another party to pay. He had signed confirmations using language that implied ownership of the charges. That crossed a line from exaggeration into misrepresentation. I didn't need to lift a finger. I had already done everything that mattered months earlier by keeping records and telling the truth when asked. Mark called me late one night. Not angry this time. Frantic. "They're threatening legal action," he said, voice tight. "They say I'm responsible for the balance because I claimed the benefits. They're freezing future bookings. Brian, you have to help me straighten this out." I listened. I let him talk. I heard something I'd never heard from him before. Fear without arrogance layered over it. "I can't fix this for you," I said calmly. "And I'm not going to lie to cover it." "You don't understand," he snapped. "This could ruin me." I thought of my kids' faces when he dismissed them, of the way he talked about me in front of them, of all the years I'd quietly absorbed things so he could stand taller. "I understand perfectly," I said. This is what happens when stories meet records. He went quiet. Then his voice dropped. So that's it. You're just going to let me fall. I closed my eyes. I'm not pushing you. I'm just not holding you anymore. That was the last real conversation we had. What followed was swift and uncomfortable. The travel company demanded repayment for benefits Mark had claimed, credits, loyalty points, compensations issued in his name. The bank reviewed his account activity and flagged inconsistencies. His credit took a hit, then another. Suddenly, the man who had always loved saying, "I've got it covered," didn't. My parents were forced to confront what they'd avoided for decades. When my dad came to me, it wasn't to ask for help. It was to apologize. "I didn't see it," he said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table weeks later. His hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee. "I didn't want to see it. You were always so capable, and Mark was always so loud." I confused the two. My mom cried. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of crying that comes when denial finally runs out. "We leaned on you because you didn't complain," she said. "That wasn't fair." "No," I said gently. "It wasn't. They didn't ask me to fix Mark's situation. Not this time." They'd finally understood that asking me to absorb consequences for someone else was part of the problem. Mark tried once more, months later. He showed up unannounced, thinner, eyes tired, pride stripped down to something raw and unpleasant. "I need a loan," he said, straight to the point. No performance left. I shook my head. "No. You have the money," he said bitterly. "Yes," I replied. "And I also have boundaries." He laughed then, a hollow sound. "So you win." I met his gaze, steady. "This was never a competition. You just turned it into one." He left without another word. The fallout wasn't explosive. It was quiet. Mark faded from the center of family gatherings. He stopped being the authority on plans, on money, on who belonged where. The silence around him was loud, and for once, it wasn't mine to fill. As for me, the rise continued. The business I'd built grew steadily. I didn't chase status or applause. I focused on sustainability, on showing my kids what consistency looked like when it wasn't paired with self-erasure. We took trips, modest ones, planned carefully, paid for transparently. My kids touched the pastries wherever we went. At the next holiday gathering, hosted at my place, there were no speeches, no declarations, just food on the table and the simple understanding that everyone there was welcome. Mark didn't come. No one commented on it. Late that night, after the house had quieted and the kids were asleep, I stood in the kitchen and thought about how strange it was that revenge hadn't felt like fire or triumph. It felt like alignment, like putting something heavy down after carrying it for too long. I didn't take anything from my brother. I just stopped letting him take from me. And that, it turned out, was enough.